I am not a historian, but neither are you. So, how about we, the people, learn this stuff together? Welcome to US 101. This is a history video, so let's see how fast YouTube demonetizes this one. Probably by now. So guys, I don't know if you've seen this yet, but I just finished Ava DuVernay's When They See Us on Netflix. It's a story about the Central Park Five, and great. This limited series definitely packs a punch, and this series came out at just the right time because before I started watching it, I was thumbing through some of my books and trying to figure out what would be the best thing to talk about for this week's episode of US 101, and then I started watching the show and I was like, why not? Why not talk about the Central Park Five? So who were, or who are, the Central Park Five? Why is their story so significant? Should they have even had a story to begin with? And what was the legacy that these five people left behind? For those answers, we have to make our way back to the 1980s and New York City. Now, just so I can set the stage for you guys, New York City in the 1980s was not the New York City that you know today. In other words, Times Square, for example, was not a place that had like a bunch of tables and chairs on the street and it was like bustling with all these crazy tourists and there weren't like colored lights and stores. It wasn't anything like that. 1980s, New York City was a much, much grittier place. The 1980s is seen by some as a time of opulence. In New York City, financial industries seemed flush with cash, and those who worked in those industries looked like they were living the life. Fancy clothes, flashy cars, Wall Street was surging, but that was only one side of the city. The other New York was one that was nowhere near the downtown upscale scene. The rise of drugs like crack cocaine infiltrated poorer communities whose populations were predominantly people of color. This led to an uptick in crime like murder and robbery in these areas, and places like Harlem became dangerous. Gangs warring with one another for control of drugs, turf, and more led to numerous people being hurt or killed. Which is kind of interesting, considering that in the 1980s, guys, cocaine was seen as this very designer, very glamorous drug used mostly by rich people, mostly rich white people. And then you had crack cocaine, which was affiliated with African Americans and Latinos and thus was given sort of a negative connotation. You wouldn't think that drug use would have a double standard, but there you have it. Anyway, so there very much was a divide between the communities of the same city, between the communities within New York City. And that actually led to a lot of tension being built up between whites and people of color. Because again, remember, crime was rampant in the 1980s in New York City, and that led a lot of people to become paranoid. A lot of people started looking over their shoulder and becoming very wary of each other. Crimes like murder, robbery, rape, they were becoming an everyday occurrence, and it got to the point where people started to wonder whether the police, the NYPD, could actually handle the amount of crime that was taking place in the city, which led to some citizens taking their fear and their paranoia and molding it into vigilantism. For example, in 1984, a New Yorker named Bernard Goetz shot and wounded 4 black men who allegedly tried to rob him in a subway car. Now, Goetz was arrested and brought up on charges like attempted murder and assault, but he ended up only being charged with possession of an unlicensed firearm. But the shooting sparked a nationwide conversation as to what lengths people should go to defend themselves.
If I had more bullets, I would have shot them all again and again. My problem was I ran out of bullets, and I was gonna gouge one of the guy's eyes out with my keys afterwards.
In 1986, 3 black New Yorkers were beaten by a mob of white men in Howard Beach, Queens, and one of the men, Michael Griffith, was struck by a car and killed while running across a highway to get away from the mob. And by 1989, guys, the murder rate in New York City was at an all-time high, with the city having 2,000 people murdered that year. But it wasn't just murder that was on the rise in New York City, thus making the city a lot more dangerous for its residents. Rape was also another crime that was slowly increasing. In fact, between the years 1988 and 1989, a string of rapes and sexual assaults were all carried out by one man. including one that took place on April 19, 1989. Her name was Trisha Miley. And on April 19, 1989, in the evening, she was out in Central Park out for a jog when she was brutally attacked, raped, and left for dead. Police found Ms. Miley in the park that night. They got her to a hospital where she luckily survived her attack. But now it was up to the police to find the perpetrator of this crime. And conveniently enough, that same night in Central Park, there were a bunch of African American and Latino kids hanging out for the evening. Corey Wise, Antron McCray, Kevin Richardson, Yusef Salaam, and Raymond Santana Jr., all aged between 14 and 16 years old in 1989, went to Central Park that night with a larger group of kids. There was no particular agenda for that evening. This large group of kids just went into Central Park that night for a place to hang. It was nice weather. They wanted a place to hang out. Problem was, within this large group of kids, there were some that were out to simply cause trouble. Some of these kids would throw rocks at cars, like pester bicyclists going through the park. Some of them would beat up homeless people that were in the park, and the police were called to break up this group of kids. Now, when the police showed up, a lot of these kids just scattered. They just ran off, right? But the police did manage to capture 5 kids that were in that group, including Raymond Santana Jr. and Kevin Richardson. And then later that evening, police would find Trisha Miley's body amongst the brush in Central Park. Following the discovery of Ms. Miley and the crime that had happened to her, Linda Fairstein, this woman right here, she was at the time the head of the sex crimes unit of the New York District Attorney's Office. And she was so convinced that a lot of the kids that were in the park that night knew what happened to Ms. Miley. So what she did is, with all the cops she had at her disposal, she sent them out into the streets and had them round up as many black and Latino kids as they could to bring them in for questioning. So more kids, including Corey Wise, Yusef Salaam, and Antron McCray, are brought into police precincts. And they are asked time and time again, what happened in the park? What were you doing in the park? What was going on in the park that night? And one of the kids responds that they were just out there wildin'. Now that word, wildin', is actually important in the narrative of the story because a slight changing of the word changes the complete description of the kids that are later accused of raping and assaulting Trisha Miley. Now, if someone tells you that they're just wilding or they're wilding out, that basically just means that they're out there doing some crazy shit with their friends. They're being dumb, they're being foolish, they're being kids, right? They're being stupid. But the police and Fairstein take that description, wildin', sound it out, add a G to the end of it, and now the word becomes wilding, which is a much different word. These black and brown boys were in the park wilding, acting like wild animals, a pack of wolves from the poorer parts of the city out hunting, looking to hurt, terrorize, assault, and maybe even murder someone. The word wilding becomes the headline in the papers, and it comes to characterize the boys who would soon become known as the Central Park Five. The Five, McCray, Richardson, Santana, Salaam, and Wise, are held in police custody for hours on end. And because these boys are scared because they've been in police custody for so long and they have no idea why they've been there for so long, they are coerced into creating false statements against each other, saying that each one of them took part in the rape and assault of Trisha Miley. Following the Five's supposed confessions, they are then named as the suspects in the rape and assault of Trisha Miley. And following that announcement, the deep divisions between the communities that already existed in New York City become even deeper. In fact, only 2 weeks after Miley's assault, a prominent real estate mogul in New York City takes out a full-page ad in multiple New York City newspapers calling for the death penalty of these boys. This mogul also takes great pains to appear on television to exclaim how much he hates those that did what they did to Trisha Miley.
You better believe that I hate the people that took this girl and raped her brutally. You better believe it. And it's more than anger, it's hatred. And I want society to hate him.
I wonder what happened to that guy. But here's the thing, when the boys finally make it to trial, it's revealed that their stories and their original confessions don't really add up to the timeline of Trisha Miley's assault. Furthermore, none of the boys' blood or DNA is found anywhere near the crime scene. The victim, Trisha Miley herself, appears in court and testifies that she doesn't really remember what happens that night and she can't identify her attacker or attackers. The evidence seems to show that the Five had nothing to do with the assault of Trisha Miley. Yet, when the verdict is read, all 5 of them are found guilty on numerous charges. Now, 4 of them, Richardson, McRae, Santana Jr., and Salam, are sent to juvenile detention because they're still underage. But one of them, Corey Wise, at the age of 16, is sent to Rikers Island, which, if you don't know anything about Rikers Island, just know that it's one of the most notorious prisons in New York. All 5 do time in prison ranging from 6 to 13 years, with Wise doing most of his time in solitary confinement. It wouldn't be until the year 2001 that a man named Matias Reyes finally comes forward and confesses to the rape and assault of Trisha Miley. The Central Park 5, the men who were originally convicted of the crime, have their records completely expunged a year later in 2002, and then in 2014, they're awarded a settlement of $41 million. Meanwhile, the real estate mogul who called for the Central Park 5 to be executed still hasn't apologized for what he said. It's kind of rude. So what do we take away from all this? Well, the concept of wilding, first off, was fleshed out in an essay that was written in 1995 by a Princeton professor named John DiLulio Jr. called The Coming of the Super Predators. Now, if that term super predators sounds kind of familiar to you, you might be thinking of when Hillary Clinton was first lady in the 1990s, and she used the term super predators, which DiLulio defined as young male predatory street criminals that were out terrorizing communities all across America. Moreover, DiLulio focuses his writing on African American boys who he claims are morally impoverished, come from one-parent families, and that as long as their, quote, youthful energies hold out, they will do what comes naturally: murder, rape, rob, assault, burglarize, deal deadly drugs, and get high. End quote. Also in the 1990s, guys, a lot of parents, specifically a lot of suburban white parents, were fearing gang culture more and more, especially with the rise of music genres like gangster rap, stories of gang warfare coming out of California between stuff like the Bloods and the Crips. I remember when I was a kid in the 90s, you'd hear about the GDs and the Latin Kings, Gangster Disciples and Latin Kings, and then you'd see gang behavior and violence and warfare in movies that Hollywood was producing in the 90s. This super predator idea had latched on. And as historian Elizabeth Hinton writes, more states began to pass legislation that, quote, made it easier to punish children as young as 13. In 1998, roughly 200,000 youths were put through the adult court system, and the majority of them were black. Now, no one uses the term super predator anymore, especially because that term would later come back to haunt Hillary Clinton during her presidential campaign in 2016. But the legacy of the Central Park 5 is seen in 2 ways during the present day. First, there are many more calls for police to be held accountable during investigations. Movements like Black Lives Matter take the police to task when officers use deadly force in situations when it might not have been necessary, which has also led to the adoption of technology like body cams. However, another lasting legacy is the idea of wilding and how certain kids from certain neighborhoods are seen as a threat when they leave their part of town. Case in point, guys, here in Chicago, in the summertime or when the weather's nice, you'll see a lot of kids from the South Side, mostly African American and Latino kids, make their way into the downtown and the Loop area, usually as large groups. And while some of the kids do end up causing trouble, making a ruckus in the stores or in public and stuff, a lot of the times the kids are just in the city, they're hanging out in their city. Right? They're a part of the city. It's their city. And they're just downtown being loud, being obnoxious, being, kids. Being just youthfully ridiculous, as we all were when we were younger. But when that happens here in Chicago, it really doesn't take very long for the police to show up and literally escort these kids back onto trains that will take them back to the South Side. Police let these kids know that they are not welcome downtown. Why? Because large groups of black kids and Latino kids are seen as a threat to tourism in the city? Because police are worried of possible violence? Or is it because too many black and brown bodies upsets a particular order of things? Because some people see these kids not as kids, but as a pack of animals, roaming the streets, hunting potential prey to hurt and assault. Wilding. It's kind of funny just thinking about this. Back in 2016, the Cubs won the World Series, and that was a huge deal in the city. In Chicago, everybody was on the streets, everybody was partying, everybody was losing their mind. My friends, we went down to Wrigley Field, well, as close as we could get to Wrigley Field because there were like hundreds of thousands of people there. But we went down to Wrigley Field and we were on the streets losing our minds. And yeah, cops were there. Cops obviously have to be there to try to keep the peace. But we didn't make it to Wrigley Field and then immediately told to get back on a train and go back to our respective neighborhoods and party. Instead, we were outside the stadium, yelling, climbing streetlights, drinking, jumping, dancing, throwing stuff, making tons of noise, tons of ruckus, upsetting an established order. You know, wilding out. And that is it for this episode of US 101, guys. Thank you so much for hanging out. Really do appreciate it. Thanks to all of you that continue to get involved in the channel and the videos, leaving comments, subscribing, sharing the videos, liking the videos. And seriously, if you've not seen Ava DuVernay's When They See Us on Netflix, go watch it. Seriously, it's a phenomenal retelling of the story. And then also, I would recommend watching Ken Burns' Central Park 5 documentary if you want a less dramatized version of the Central Park 5 story. Both are incredibly good. I highly recommend you watch both. As always, you can follow US 101 on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, all those links down below in the description box. Guys, I will see you next time for another episode of US 101. Until then, I am all done.